The Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Glory to you, O God. That same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there, while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on a path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. If you have ears, hear. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while. And when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of this age and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. You'll have to bear with me. I had a struggle printing this morning, and the text is really small, and I'm 30 now, so my eyes are feeling a little older.
Oi.
In 2022, my wife Grace and I lived a simple and minimalist life near Sequoia National Park in our RV, and we spent a great deal of time outdoors enjoying living among nature. It was so special to experience all the highs and lows of the wilderness, beauty, peace, flora and fauna, but unfortunately also some more severe conditions at times, and often the threat of wildfires. More than once we found ourselves ready to evacuate if the fire moved further down the mountain, but our campground was ultimately spared. One warm winter after fires had ripped through Kings Canyon the previous summer, we took one of our regular hike paths that still showed much evidence of being touched by flames. Grace and I were particularly surprised, though, to find regrowth and regeneration of the plants on the forest floor. It was a remarkable sight to have lush green leaves juxtaposed with scorched bark. The soil there, it turns out, was good soil indeed. When Jesus tells the parable we find in today's gospel, it sounds deceptively simple. A farmer walks out into a field with a bag full of seed. He scatters it everywhere. Some lands on the path, where the birds quickly eat it. Some falls on rocky ground, where it springs up fast, but withers just as quickly. Some lands among thorns that choke it. And finally, some falls on good soil and produces an astonishing harvest. We've heard this story so many times, probably, that it's easy to assume we already know what it means. Usually the sermon becomes a question directed at us. What kind of soil are you? Are you hard-packed, rocky, thorny, good? It can start to sound like a spiritual personality test. Figure out your category, then work harder to become the good soil. The trouble is that Jesus never tells us to improve our soil. He never says, go become fertile ground, because soil doesn't transform itself. A field doesn't wake up one morning and decide to have fewer rocks. Hard ground doesn't soften because it tries harder. Thorns don't politely remove themselves. So perhaps the first question isn't, how do I become good soil? Perhaps the first question is, who is this sower who keeps throwing seed everywhere? Because if we're honest, the sower seems reckless. Any experienced farmer would tell you this is an inefficient way to plant a crop. Why waste seed on the path? Why throw it into thorns? Why scatter it over rocky ground? If you were trying to maximize your return, you'd save your seed for the places where it had the highest chances of success. Instead, Jesus describes someone who refuses to ration grace. The sower scatters seed with open hands everywhere, no calculations or cost-benefit analysis or careful screening of who deserves another chance. Just abundance. And that sounds remarkably like Jesus himself. Look at the people in whom Jesus invested his life. Tax collectors, people living with diseases that made them social outcasts, women whose voices were dismissed, people possessed by demons, foreigners. The religious establishment looked at these people and saw bad investments. Jesus looked at them and saw beloved children of God. Throughout Matthew's gospel, the people who end up bearing fruit are almost never the ones everyone expects. Jesus tells the chief priests that tax collectors and prostitutes are entering God's kingdom ahead of them. Later, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, those who fed the hungry, welcomed the stranger, clothed the naked, and visited the imprisoned are surprised to discover that they had been serving Christ all along. The fruitful ones aren't spiritual superstars. They're ordinary people whose lives become places where God's compassion takes root. Maybe that changes how we hear this parable, because if we're looking for the good soil, we may be looking in the wrong places. God often finds fertile ground where the world sees only failure. And really, most of us don't fit neatly into just one category anyway. Some days my heart feels open and hopeful. Other days it feels exhausted. Sometimes grief hardens us and fear crowds out hope. Sometimes anxiety grows like weeds until it's difficult to hear anything else. And sometimes joy opens us to God's presence in ways we never expected. Within every congregation, there are all kinds of soil. Within every person, there are all kinds of soil. Grace is God's refusal to abandon places everyone else has written off. Grace is discovering that even after seasons of disappointment, loss, or doubt, something new begins to grow. The good news is that Jesus never suggests the sower walks away. The sower keeps sowing again and again and again. God refuses to give up on us. And if this is true for individuals, it is also true for communities. Sometimes entire neighborhoods are treated like rocky ground. Sometimes people living in poverty are viewed as problems to manage instead of neighbors to love. Sometimes immigrants are reduced to political talking points instead of being recognized as people made in God's image. Sometimes those living on the streets become invisible because we see their tents before we see their humanity. Sometimes entire communities carry the weight of racism that has accumulated over generations, creating obstacles that were never of their own making. Our world becomes very good at deciding where no harvest could ever happen. Jesus refuses those assumptions. He keeps scattering hope and dignity and mercy and love, even where everyone else has stopped expecting life. That says something about how the church is called to live. Churches often develop the same instincts we see in ourselves. We want certainty. We want measurable success. We want to invest where we're confident things will work out. Sometimes we become cautious with our generosity. We ask whether helping our neighbors is sustainable. Those aren't bad questions. They're responsible questions. Yet Jesus also consistently invites us into a different imagination. His ministry doesn't revolve around efficiency. It revolves around abundance. He sends disciples to places where they will be rejected. He feeds crowds who have nothing to offer in return. He heals people who cannot repay him. He tells stories about shepherds leaving 99 sheep to search for one. Again and again, God's economy operates through extravagant love. As followers of Jesus, perhaps our calling isn't to guarantee success. Perhaps our calling is to simply keep sowing. We sow every time we welcome someone who wonders whether they belong, every time we confront racism or advocate for affordable housing. We sow every time we care for creation, knowing that the earth itself is one of God's first gifts, and that climate change weighs most heavily on communities with the fewest resources. We sow every time we comfort someone who is grieving, even when we have no perfect words. Every time we choose compassion over cynicism. Sometimes we will never see what grows. The conversation we thought accomplished nothing may become someone's turning point years later. The child who learned they were loved in Sunday school may carry that truth through decades of hardship. The meal shared with a hungry neighbor may restore hope in ways we may never witness. The stand we take for justice may inspire courage in someone we've never met. Paul reminds the Corinthians, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. That takes enormous pressure off us. Faith itself is God's gift. Transformation and the harvest belongs to God. Our task is much simpler. Scatter the seed, love generously, welcome freely, keep showing up, keep trusting and hoping. There are plenty of reasons to lose heart these days. The realities we face can feel like rocky ground, or thorn-filled fields, or hard-packed paths where nothing could possibly grow. Jesus never pretends those obstacles aren't real. The parable names them. Much of the seed appears to fail. There is loss and disappointment and resistance, and yet that is not the ending. Some seeds find good soil. Some hope takes root. Some lives are transformed. Some communities become places of healing. Some acts of justice ripple further than anyone could have ever imagined. The harvest comes, not because the conditions were perfect, but because the sower never stopped sowing. That may be the deepest promise in this story. God has not given up on this world, the church, your neighbor. God has not given up on you. Even when your own heart feels weary and faith feels fragile, the seed is still falling. The Spirit is still at work. Christ is still walking among fields that others have abandoned. And somehow, against all expectations, life continues to emerge. 30-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold. May we trust the generosity of the sower. May we join in the joyful work of scattering seeds of hope wherever we go. And may we leave the harvest in the hands of the God who has been bringing life out of impossible places from the very beginning. Amen.
Amen.